Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Delia. I am Achuda's assistant, and I am filling in for him this speaker series since he is currently on vacation. So today is the first talk of the summer speaker series. Our guest today is Spencer Michaud, who will be teaching us about the Decans. And I will say more about Spencer in just a moment. But before that, I would just like to say a few words about the speaker series and what it's all about. So since around 2010, Nightlight Astrology has been hosting an annual speaker series. They are 12 talks on the year, 3 per zodiacal season, wherein Achuda invites various different astrologers to come on and do guest lectures. Today, we are kicking off the summer speaker series, and the purpose of this speaker series is twofold. First of all, it is to allow quality astrological education to the public at large. Astrology is this beautiful mystical art, but it can also be expensive. And very often people can be priced out of things such as attending conferences, etc. Of course, there hasn't been a lot of traveling or public gatherings in this past year, but the point still stands. So the Nightlight Speaker Series is designed to highlight old and new voices in astrology, and it's also intended to allow Achuda students enrolled in any of his programs to be exposed to different topics than are covered in his curriculums, and different voices as well. So I'm going to show you where you can find actually before that, excuse me. These talks are completely free and open to the public. In previous years, they were donation-based, but thanks to the generous support of everybody who has donated to the annual Kickstarter campaigns, we are able to make these talks completely free to attend, while at the same time being able to offer our speakers a very, very generous speaker's fee. So I'm going to show you where you will be able to find the replays of the talks, the upcoming talks, and how to register for those if you haven't already. Just one moment, please. All right. Spencer, can you confirm, is the Nightlight website on the screen?
Yep, looks good.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so if you go to nightlightastrology.com and click here on the events page, speaker series, you will be able to see all of the scheduled talks per season. So this is Spencer's talk for today. And then tomorrow we will be having Charlie Obert giving a talk on the Lots of Fortune and Spirit. Please notice that the time for tomorrow's talk is different. It starts at 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then next Saturday, we will be having Danielle Blackwood in to speak on the second Saturn return. And that talk is going to be on July 24th at noon. If you haven't registered for these talks yet, you can do so on this page. And also, we always get questions about replays. The replays of this talk will be available to everybody right here on the Nightlight events page. Beginning tomorrow, there will be a button right here where you can watch the replay, which will be up for 7 days. And if you are a currently enrolled student, then you will be receiving the recording of each of these talks along with your class materials. Okay, so allow me to introduce Spencer. He is a very talented, hardworking, and thorough astrologer with a wide range of interests and a very multidisciplinary approach, I would say. This is just going to read your biography as it is on the site, Spencer. Spencer Michaud is a professional astrologer who focuses on self-actualization and empowerment. He uses an interdisciplinary approach incorporating both modern and traditional Hellenistic chart reading techniques, as well as other divinatory methods such as numerology, tarot, the I Ching, and archetypal storytelling. His readings focus on actionable, grounded wisdom using the power of choice and transcendence to help you find the hero within. Spencer has over 15 years' experience studying the ancient wisdom traditions and symbolic languages and is a certified graduate of Achyuta Das's Nightlight Hellenistic Astrology courses. In addition to his studies with Achyuta, Michaud is inspired by the traditional work pioneered by Robert Schmidt, Dimitri George, Austin Coppock, and Chris Brennan, as well as modern mythological-based practitioners such as Bernadette Brady and Liz Green. And you can find all of his links, websites, socials, etc., right here. So, oh, okay, there we go. Okay, and just a few words on the protocol and etiquette for the talk. The chat box has been set to panelists only, so you can send in chat box messages. Spencer and I will see them, but it's not publicly open in order to reduce distractions. If you have questions about the talk itself, please type them into the Q&A box and Spencer will address them as he is able to, if like during the talk or at the Q&A at the end of his presentation. Is that correct, Spencer?
Yeah, we can take a few questions in the middle as we go through sort of a historical overview. I'm going to be incorporating techniques within the history. So if people have questions, we can ask that. And of course, we'll leave some time at the end to kind of dive in and have a conversation.
All right, Spencer, I'm seeing a comment that your volume is low, actually.
Check, check, check. Is this better?
Yes, that's better.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Deli. I appreciate your support, and I'm really excited to be here. I've been a student of Achyuta's since I met him at the United Astrology Conference in 2018, and really big fan of his programs. And I wouldn't be here today and without his guidance. And took his first year course and his second year course twice, and his horary course twice. So really big fan and really grateful for the wisdom that he's been able to share. I also wanted to make sure that I gave a special acknowledgement before I got started to Austin Coppock. Without his research in the book 36 Faces, this talk wouldn't have been possible as well. He kind of blazed the trail as far as gathering sources and doing a really thorough deep dive into the Decans, and gave us like the breadcrumb trail to be able to follow and hopefully expand and find new angles and lenses to look at these things through. And I hope that I can add something meaningful to the conversation. So yeah, today what we're going to do is we're going to go through some of the history of the Decans. And as we do that, we are going to incorporate technique as we go along. So the Decans have been changing for a long period of time, and there's different lenses that we can look at them through. And I think that it's important to kind of have context for what we're going to be experiencing, because there's been so many different approaches to the way that people have looked at this particular astrological technique. So with that being said, let's start can you all see, Delia? Are we good? Can you see me on the screen here?
Yes, all good.
All right. So let's drop the puck and get going. We have some visuals and some animated visuals incorporated to the talk today. So I hope that adds some interest. All right, so here we go. Let's get going on to the next page. All right, so today we're going to be defining what a decan is, We're going to be going through a brief history. We're going to be kind of tracing that from the ancient Egyptian age up until modernity. We're going to talk about their cultural significance because that is a really big deal as far as how we view those decanic symbols, is the cultural lens that we're looking through. And I think that that's really important to understand with astrology in general. A lot of what we are experiencing with our specific symbols cannot be removed from the culture that they came from. And I think that we can work to update the symbols for our own particular lenses and cultures, but I think seeing how they've already moved from one culture to another can give us guidance into how we might bring it into the current age. We are going to look a little bit at how the Decans were looked at through rulership schemes. There's a number of different ways to assign rulers and deities and spirits to the Decans, as well as different planetary rulerships. So we'll take a look at that. We're going to be looking at some of the way that the Vedic tradition approached decanic rulership, the Chaldeans. We're going to look at a syncretization with the tarot, the Rider-Waite Tarot specifically. We're going to look at how Decans were used in talismanic magic today. This was a really important part of the way that Decans were approached, especially in the medieval and Renaissance period. And I'm going to show you some examples of a particular talismanic election that we did for Aries 2. So we'll go over that. We're going to talk about how to integrate these into your own practice and some of the daily habits that might get you a more thorough understanding of the Decans. This really does take practice. So this is something where it's really important, I think, to really just stick with it, because there's a lot of information and a lot of lenses that you can look through. We'll also look at the chart of this talk today and break down the chart of this talk through the decanic lens and see if we can find some meaning and signification so that you can learn how to use these tools in action in your own chart interpretations. So what we're seeing here is a reconstruction of the Dendera zodiac with the original colors added. This is the round zodiac of Dendera that was taken from the temple of Hathor and Isis by Napoleon, and it's now in the Louvre. So it was basically blasted out of this Egyptian temple and stuck in Paris. And there's been different reliefs that people have made of it to study it and things of that nature. But you can see here that we have the circle of the zodiac and the Decans in the middle. So what is a Decan? So here we're seeing the sky moving over the Egyptian pyramids, and this is kind of where our journey begins. First and foremost, the Decans are an ancient division of solar time. They were used to measure how you figured out the hours of the day and the night. So it's easy to measure the hours of the day because we can measure sunlight and shadow. But to measure time during the night, we don't have the advantage of the sun, and we need to have another type of marker. So the ancient Egyptians were using the helical rising of specific fixed stars to determine the time of day. So that's one approach that we had, and we'll talk about helical rising in a minute. The Decans were also 10-degree sections of the zodiac as we move forward in the history of a 360-degree zodiac. Each sign is divided into 30, and then each of those signs is further divided into 3. So we will try to unpack the significance of that. The Decans are also houses for deities and spirits. There are many cultural documents that talk about these being places for the gods, or places for daimons, or guides, spirit guides. We will examine some of the sources for that. We can also think of these as a changing set of iconic images. That's really important because there's this visual narrative that comes from the Decans that has especially been played out through the tarot as well. And it's really interesting to see some of the real life situations that play out through the decans. We're going to see a shift from the decans being the houses of spirits and gods to being kind of stripped of those deities and more reflective of real life situations. And some of that comes from a switch to a monotheistic worldview. So one of the things that we get started with, again, the last thing that we have on our list here of what a decan is it's in a form of essential dignity. We've got other forms of essential dignity, like a planet being in its own domicile, its exaltation, triplicity, etc. And a planet in its own face, or decan, was sort of a minor dignity from the kind of the Renaissance period that was able to give a planet that was peregrine or didn't have any other type of dignity something that it could hold on to. And we'll examine that when we get to the section when we talk about Guido Benadi and how he looked at the decans. One thing to keep in mind is that the word decan comes from the Greek root word dekanoi, and deca means 10. So we have other words that incorporate 10 into them. Decade is 10 years. Decimate meant to kill 1 out of every 10 people. Not the most, not the nicest definition it's applied to. A decahedron is a solid with 10 sides. So we've got that kind of deca root that is contributing to our understanding and 10. So the Egyptians here had this understanding that a certain star would rise at a certain period of time and become visible outside of the rays of the sun. So let's take a look at our next slide here. So before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about how we're going to approach this today. We have this experience of a lens. So are we going to be looking at these things from a telephoto angle? Are we going to have an up close, macro lens? I think of this like this tool that you get at the optometrist. It's called a phoropter, and it has these little lenses that you constantly shift that give you the ability to bring things into focus. And you get the eye doctor saying, hey, does number 1 or number 2 look better? Which lens do you do? And he's constantly making adjustments. The thing to remember is that is a subjective test. I want to really stress that. If we think of maybe truth, or maybe an objective truth, if we can say that that's even possible, that might be something like the eye chart. If we were thinking about the lenses that we're looking through, potentially that could be the techniques or the cultural viewpoint that we have of the decans that are making these adjustments in the lenses. And finally, we have to receive that information into our eyes and be fed that info into our brains to create a subjective experience of whatever we are witnessing. Now, one of the books that really inspired me over the course of my studies was Jeffrey Cornelius's The Moment of Astrology. And in it, he talks about the creation of oracular space. And I think this is the experience of walking into the eye doctor and sitting down in that chair. And that is the oracular space. And we're going to look through these different lenses to get a different experience of these symbols. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is that we have an image here in the lower corner where when we put different colored lenses in, some different things will pop out and some different things will completely disappear. And I think that that's sort of how the decans have been approached over the course of history, is they were constantly shifting the lenses so that things like the spirits would disappear, but other things like the effects that those decanic spirits might have had would come to the forefront. The real life lived experiences versus the gods that were creating them. Okay, so let's move forward. So we're going to start off in ancient Egypt. And in ancient Egypt, the decanic lens, or the symbols, were often found in the lids of coffins. They were tied to the helical rising of various stars and constellations to mark out solar time into 36 10-day weeks. Now, there were 5 extra days that were accounted for, because if you do your math, you can see that 10 times 36, star decans is only 360 days. They accounted for these 5 extra days with an interesting little myth that refers to the sky goddess of the night, Nut. And they thought that Nut was barren during these 5 days. And her friend, Toth, made a bet with the moon goddess, Kosu, but Kosu lost that bet. And from that bet, Toth acquired the ability to give fertility to Nut, who then gave birth to 5 different gods: Horus, Osiris, Set, Isis, and Nephthys. And those gods were honored in these 5 extra days. So this is these are star clocks that we're looking at, and they were found in the coffin lids of pharaohs. And there's a really interesting theory about mummification and the role that they may have played in that process. But the ancient Egyptians thought of the Decans as housing a specific god or deity that was responsible for some kind of natural phenomenon that corresponded with that correct time of year. So in our example here, we can see that Sirius was the fixed star that appeared over the horizon when the Nile would flood again, and it symbolized the return of life to the valley. This is one of the reasons why the Egyptian zodiac begins with Cancer. So the Egyptian year begins with that flooding of the Nile. We can see this reflected in the Thema Mundi, which is the ancient metaphorical natal chart of the world. So if we do ever, and we need to be careful if we ever make conflations with signs and houses, but a much more logical way to do that would be to put Cancer on the ascendant and then put the rest of the signs around. And we'll see that when we get to a theory that I have of the Thema Mundi and the tarot that reflects some of the decanic stories. Okay, so let's move forward. So this is a picture of a cenotaph of Seti I. This is an inscription on the tomb of Seti. And here we see an ancient star clock that is read from right to left, and each one of these is a decan. So you can kind of see the decan and kind of the relationship of the stars that precede and come after it. Now, Sirius is here in the middle, and you can see it's taller than all of the other ones because they gave extra importance to Sirius. So there is a really interesting theory that I came across in my research that references the Book of Nut. And I hope I'm saying that correctly. I might not be. A lot of these names, I will have to figure out how to say them correctly. I think that there's some debate on Egyptian names in particular because we don't really have a recording of their language, and all we have are these hieroglyphics. But the Book of Nut was a collection of ancient Egyptian astronomical texts. And here we see a star clock, okay, from right to left. And in an article that I came across from David Warner Matheson called The Dendra Zodiac and the Message of the Decans, he outlines a really interesting process that relates to the mummification process. So we have the research of a man named Otto Neugebauer, where he was a mathematician and a scientist who talked about the heliacal rising of fixed stars. So just very briefly, the heliacal rising of fixed stars is a reference to the star emerging from under the beams of the sun. When a star goes behind the beams of the sun, it disappears, or it appears to disappear. And we can see this reflected when Mercury goes under the beams as it makes a conjunction with the sun, or any other planet when it makes a conjunction with the sun at the beginning of its synodic cycle. And this was important to the Egyptians because they thought of the star going into the underworld at that period of time. So when the decan, or the star, they thought of decans as specific stars, was not visible, it was in the underworld, acting as like a psychopomp, like we think of as Mercury when it enters under the beams. And a psychopomp was a guide of souls to the underworld, or a guide of souls of the dead. So there in the underworld, the decan star was envisioned being embalmed like a mummy and purified for 70 days. So that was the amount of time that they used to talk about mummification. And this theory was brought to us by Alvin Boyd Kuhn. So when the decan would reappear, this would be the star being reborn. when it came outside of the beams of the sun, it was visible in the morning on the eastern horizon, and you'd be able to see the star. And they said that they thought that star was a god, and that god had power for that 10-day period of time that star would be able to be visible. And then the next star would rise, and then that god would take over. So this 70-day mummification process is really interesting, though, because Alvin Boyd, in a book called Lost Light, talks about this mummification period being a preparation for the next life. But he also outlines that this incarnation into a body here on Earth is similar to the mummification process. And we are metaphorically being thrust into a body in this mortal life to be able to go through that similar process that a dead body would in mummification to get ready for the next life. So having a soul infused in a body was like going through that mummification process so that we can be reborn into some kind of next life. And I thought that was really fascinating to think of. Maybe we're being mummified in a body in this life itself. I thought that was really fascinating and something worth looking at when we're thinking about the Decans themselves and how they were used in the past. All right, if we continue to move forward, we see in the Hellenistic period, here we're looking at the ruins of the Library of Alexandria. I told you we were going to go on a journey today, so we'll try to visit those ruins via a video here. But during the Hellenistic period, which most people consider starting around 327 to 325 BCE with the conquering of Greece by Alexander the Great. Now, Alexander the Great conquered Greece and brought with him a fusion of Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Babylonian cultures. Because of this new empire that he created, people were able to move more freely through trade routes, and not only were goods distributed throughout the lands, but also ideas. And one of the great tragedies of history is this loss of this great library where we had collections of these manuscripts from many different cultures. And it is very sad to think about all the wisdom that we lost and all the recreating that we had to do and how much that might have set us back. During this time period, there was one of Alexander's generals, whose name was Ptolemy, was given reign over the city of Alexandria, and he was named King Ptolemy. And that was the political capital and cultural center of this time frame. And one of the techniques that we see coming out of this time frame, I mean, we have Hellenistic astrology as a whole sort of emerging, I would say, in the 1st century AD. Some people will argue with that, but it's hard to really understand time frames when we're trying to reconstruct all of these things. But one of the techniques that comes out of this is a shift from, the Decans being solely houses of deities and attributing planetary rulership to the specific areas of the zodiac. The other thing that happened was that these Decans, instead of just being tied to specific fixed stars, became attached to a 360-degree tropical zodiac, which begins not with the flooding of the Nile necessarily, but with the equinox, with the summer solstice, when the sun reaches its highest point and the days are the longest. So we have this fixed cross of matter that holds this zodiac in place, with the summer solstice being the highest point of the sun, and then the descent. And then we have the winter solstice being the point where the sun is at its lowest and it starts to return in height and the days begin to become longer. And then we have the equinoxes, the spring equinox where day and night are equal and the day starts to increase, and the fall equinox where they're equal once again and the daylight starts to decrease. So this was really important because this kind of shifted the way that the lens that we looked at the zodiac through, or the Decans through. We see later in the Vedic tradition or Jyotisha that they had a different type of zodiac called the sidereal zodiac that sort of made more of an account for precession and tying it more to some of the stars Precession is a kind of an idea where the zodiac, or the background of the constellations and the fixed stars, are moving slightly, a little bit each year, I believe 1 degree for every 72 years. So the original tropical zodiac and the background of the fixed stars was lined up in this period of time for the most part. But as time has gone on, they have split apart. And there's been all this debate about which zodiac should you use and which is the correct one. And I guess I'd make the argument through my examination of decans is that I think you can overlap them. I think you can layer them, and you can find meaning by using both and incorporating both into your practice. Okay, let's keep going. Here we see one of the first and earliest sources of the decans in print. So this is Teucer of Babylon, and we see Teucer of Babylon referenced in the book Rhetorius the Egyptian that was translated by James H. Holden, who is a monumental figure for interpreting and translating ancient texts into English. So this is just sort of an appendix at the back of Rhetorius, where Teucer of Babylon goes over the kind of the properties of each of the signs, and they mention the decans. And his approach, Teucer's, this 2nd century BCE astrologer, has later been referenced by Valens, Antiochus, Firmicus Maternus, and other subsequent magical grimoires like the Agrippa book, the 3 books of occult philosophy, and the Picatrix. So I'm just going to read you a quote from Teucer because I want you to keep this in the back of your mind when we are looking at further identifications with and further literature on the decans, because I think that all of it is sort of coming back to this point. So this is what he has to say on Aries. And it has 3 decans, and the following stars rise with the first decan: Athena and the tail of Cetus, and the third of the triangulum, and the cynocephalus bearing the lamp, and the head of Ilurus of the dodecaros. With the second decan, there rise Andromeda and the middle of Cetus, and the Gorgon and the sword of Perseus, and half of the triangulum. The middle of Ilurus of the dodecaros. And with the third decanate, there rise Cassiopeia sitting on her throne, Perseus head downwards, the head of Cetus, and the rearmost part of triangulum, the tail of Ilurus and the dodecaros. And besides this, the first decan bears the influence of Mars, the second of the Sun, and the third of Venus. Now, throughout the talk, I'm going to highlight specific points that I want to really put emphasis on. And that's, I think, the first one. If we take a look and analyze this statement by Teucer, we can see that what he's doing is he's outlining constellations that are rising over the eastern horizon, much like the decans did in Egyptian culture, where we could see the stars, marking out time by rising and separating from the beams of the sun in the morning on the eastern horizon. So Cetus is that big whale in the sky, and you can see if I at the end of the talk, if we have some time, I'll show you maybe my sky chart, and we can see like the tail of Cetus will rise in that specific area of the zodiac. The cynocephalus, in my research, I found that was sort of like a jackal-headed man is what I found that. And I think that may be a reference to Anubis. And the Egyptians think of that Anubis constellation, I think in the similar fashion that we ascribe the little bear to Ursa Minor. So I think Ursa Minor may have been thought of as the jackal-headed deity in this time frame. So we see Andromeda rise. All of it really matches up. The Gorgon and the sword of Perseus is Perseus holding the head of Medusa, and the fixed star Algol. All of those things were in this sort of area of the zodiac. So that's the first thing to recognize, is it's definitely reflecting the rising of constellations and fixed stars still. But again, this is the first time we see planets attributed to the decans. And those planets are attributed in Chaldean order. So let's take a look at what Chaldean order is. So Chaldean order, and you can see the decanic planetary rulerships in my in my visual aid here, 3 decanic planetary rulers for each sign. So Chaldean or Ptolemaic order, again, Ptolemy, some of this comes to us from Ptolemy and like the Amalgist and the Tetrabiblos and his work. He was an encyclopedia compendium author of astrological techniques. So, and the Chaldeans were these ancient mystics and sages that a lot of this material was attributed to. So this is a way of ordering the 7 classical planets according to their relative speeds as seen from Earth. The planets were arranged in descending order from slowest to fastest. So we have Saturn in the uppermost sphere, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun in the very middle, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. So the Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars were said to be called the superior planets because they're outside the sphere of the Sun, and Venus, the Mercury, and Moon were inferior because they were inside the rotation of the Sun. So the Chaldean order was a system used to assign planetary rulers of the Decans, and we start with Aries 1 with Mars. So you can see here, we have Mars in Aries 1, and we go in descending Chaldean order. So then we have the Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and it keeps repeating. And each planet has 5 decans, and 7 times 5 is 35. But that leaves us with one extra. So we give the extra one to Mars, which is in Pisces 3 here. So you can see we begin the cycle with Mars and end the cycle with Mars. Manilius, who was another author around the early astrological, Hellenistic period, offers an alternate scheme in his Astronomica where he assigns signs to each decan. So for example, in Aries 1, he would assign Aries to this decan, and then then Taurus to the next decan, and then Gemini to the next decan. And in Taurus, it would go Cancer, Leo, Virgo. Now, this is something that was used later in Vedic astrology. And we'll talk about that when we get there. It's just kind of an interesting footnote of how different systems were assigned to planetary rulership. Okay. Everybody doing okay? Any questions before I keep going?
There's a question, but it's not directly related to this. I don't know if you want it now or later.
Okay, well, let's save it and we'll keep on rolling.
Okay.
Okay, the houses of spirits, deities, and daimons. So, over the course of history, various authors and traditions have ascribed daimonic spirits or deities to the decans. These ethereal powers, amongst other things, had responsibility over parts of the body and their diseases. So here we're seeing decans being attributed to body parts and being responsible for both the disease itself and potentially the cure. We see this approach in a book called Methesis by Firmicus Maternus, who called the decans the houses of the literogoi. And that is a Greek word that means minister. He also describes them as soldiers, ministers or soldiers. Now, Firmicus did a really interesting thing that we'll also see reflected in the Vedic or Jyotisha tradition, where he further divided the decans into 3 parts. So this is later used in a technique called divisional charts, where we are describing Vedic dracanas. So we'll take a look at the Vedic dracanas and what they're used for later on in the talk, but I thought that was an interesting side note that it originally appears in Firmicus Maternus. There was an astrologer that I believe did a talk here at the Nightlight series. What's his name? I can't remember. His name is escaping me right now, but he's from San Diego, and he was talking about there's a little bit of feta in my curry, and he was talking about the exchange of cultural knowledge between the Indian system and the Hellenistic system and how they are definitely influencing one another over time. One interesting thing about the Vedic tradition that I think is worth noting is that system has remained largely intact over the course of 2,000 years, where the Hellenistic and Greek system was sort of broken up and went underground and then reappeared. So we might be able to find even more clarity from examining the Indian system more closely as well and seeing if it'll give us clues to unpacking Hellenistic astrology. So other sources for these decanic spirits include a fragmentary text called 36 Heirs of the Zodiac. Now, this is a text that also, the only one that I could find online was also called Cosmos of Jerusalem, which was a translation by Ludwig Meisel. And this was attributed to the Zoroastrians. And it just lists these different deities and gods for the different decans. And it gives some alternate names for the houses and things of that nature. I've got it in front of me. It's really short. It's just a really small printout of like 2 pages. They give these different gods that may be co-inhabitants of the planets in this. But mostly the thing of interest here is that it has a specific list that includes some Greek minor deities, some that are Egyptian, like Osiris, and yeah, it's really fascinating. And that's one of the lists that I use to incorporate decanic spirit and meaning into my practice. Now here we see that a picture of the Greek god or goddess Nemesis, who was responsible for restoring right proportion. And this was the decanic spirit of Libre 3, the decan that the moon is moving through today. So we're, maybe in an attempt to distill all this information today, we are trying to restore balance and right proportion. So really interesting way to think about the decans themselves and the houses of the spirits. Let's move forward. All right, so now we've gotten to the point in time where we are looking at the Indian Vedic system, the time period around the 4th century, where we have this appearance of this Sanskrit text called the Yavana Jataka. So there was a bunch of Hellenistic Greek techniques that appeared in this, and the decans were recast as dracanas. So these faces were shifting because of the lens of the Hindu beliefs and sensibilities, right? So we're now viewing them through that lens, and their own culture was applied to their meanings. Okay, so some of the things that we saw in the Greek and Egyptian systems were stripped, and then we infused new meanings into the decans through their own cultural beliefs. So during this period of time, these images, all right, fit into one of 4 categories. So we have Sarpa, which is the serpent, Ayuda, which means armed, Hutaspad, which means animal, and Kagha, which means bird. And I apologize if I'm butchering those names. I hope that I'm pronouncing them at least closely to being correct. So like we described earlier in Firmicus's work, each decan was divided into thirds, further divided into thirds. So we have the signs divided into 10-degree sections, and those 10-degree sections divided into 3-degree 20-minute sections or divisions. And we get the number 108, and that is a sacred number in Hinduism. It's reflected in mantra chants and the way that the number of times we will say a different mantra to a specific deity in this tradition, and there's 108 beads on a string of prayer beads. Rulership of each of these dracanas is based on the elemental triplicity method. So when I refer to the triplicity method, when I'm exploring decans, this is one of the sources for that. So we start with the sign ruler itself. So here we see Aries 1, and we're going to start with Mars, the ruler of Aries. And as we move into the second decan, we reflect the ruler of Leo, the sun. In Aries 3, we have Sagittarius and Jupiter. So these are all the planets of the rulers of this fire element triplicity. If we look at another example, we have Taurus 1, starting with Venus, which is the ruler of Taurus, and then we move on to Mercury, which is the ruler of Virgo, and Taurus 3 reflects Saturn as the ruler of Capricorn. And it's very similar for each of the different signs and decanic sets. So this decanic system, this triplicity method, is called Parasara Draskana. And it was one of 4, and possibly more, different types of rulership schemes that made slight adjustments to this triplicity method. So there's other types. The Yaganath Dracana, and each of them were used for a different type of life topic that they wanted to examine. So the Parasara Dracana evaluated siblings and the third house in general. The Yaganath was used to describe sort of what you were passionate about or what was inspiring to you. The Paravritta Treya talked about your skills or possibly blockages to the manifestation of those skills. And then we have the Somnath Dracana, which talks about overall vitality and health and things of that nature. So again, in this time period, they were using a sidereal zodiac, which is different than a constellational zodiac. So it doesn't match up exactly with the constellations, but they do have specific techniques that make adjustments for precession. So it is closer, I think, to the original constellations and stars than our tropical zodiac is now, because of the almost 27-degree difference between the original kind of tropical zodiac and where it's precessed to now. But they had specific techniques to account for that. Now here in this picture, we're looking at a folio of the manuscript of the Yavan Jataka, which is preserved in the National Archive of Nepal. Okay, let's keep going. So we move forward to the Arabic period. And during this period, here we see a portrait of Abu Mashar, who was one of the most prominent astrologers of this era. And we have some new wonderful translations from Benjamin Dykes of Abu Mashar's Great Introduction, which is an amazing book that talks about the Decans and various other astrological techniques. And in this period of time, because of a transition to a monotheistic worldview, they weren't super down with polytheism and thinking of all the Decans as having their own gods. These faces were stripped of those godlike powers and spirits, and instead transitioned to symbolic images of real life situations. So we're going from cause, the gods, to reflecting images of their effects. So I think this is very interesting, because I think we see this reflected in the tarot. And the images in the tarot, we're not necessarily seeing the gods themselves in the images of the Rider-Waite Tarot, but perhaps the effects of those decans and what we might expect to experience on Earth when a planet is moving through that area of the zodiac. So here is a quote from Abu Mashar talking about the decans. He says, "Now, as for some of their indications, they, the decans, are similar to their physical shape, name, or situation. As for others, their indication is far from that, but those learned in the profession of the stars and knowledge of both higher and earthly things understand them. In their mentioning these images in the manner they did, the ancients did not have in mind that there would be images like them in the circle, aka the zodiac, marked out by lines, a shape, and a body, so that each image would ascend from that form in every face of the signs. But for every position in the circle and every face of the signs, they found special property in the indication of things coming to be in this world." So he's making the point that we were talking about earlier. Now he does say that some of the images in the decans are going to reflect some of the constellational images that we see and play out quite literally. And I've seen that in practice as well. Some of the narratives that come up when I examine planets of a natal chart reflect some of the mythological stories that we see coming from the specific constellations and fixed stars in that decan. But he's saying that it's maybe a little bit more complicated than that, and that there are additional meanings that we can ascribe to it. So, again, a new lens. Now, one of the things that I wanted to read to you is another excerpt from the Great Introduction that I have in front of me here from Benjamin Dykes. We're going to focus a little bit on Aries too today, because this is one of the faces that we did a talismanic election for. So you'll get to kind of have a complete understanding of that. So for each of the decans, he has 3 sections where he talks about, very much like Tusar of Babylon, the rising of the constellations. He then talks about the approach that the the Indians or the Vedic astrologers had to them, and then something regarding what Ptolemy was talking about. So for Aries 2, on page 316 of the Great Introduction translated by Ben Dykes, he says, in the second face of Aries ascends Andromeda. In the middle of that, sea fish. It is the Ekar, and that's Cetus, right? In the middle, and the middle of the triangle, and the middle of the Tamor, the half of the snake, and a field for sowing, a sea ship, and a horseman with a lance in his hand, and a woman combing her head, an armor made of iron, and the head of the ghoul, and the scimitar of Perseus, that is the sword of Perseus. And Perseus is the one bearing the head of the ghoul, and in Arabic it is called the mongoose, and in Persian, Philsas. So you can see it sounds very similar to Tusar of Babylon, to the point where we can probably assume that Abu Mashar had access to that earlier document. And it's coming to us via Abu Mashar, right? He also goes on to say the Indians claim that in this face ascends a woman with a garment on her and a red cloth, having a single foot, her image resembling the image of a horse, and her soul, in her soul, she would go and seek clothes, ornaments, and children. And then the third part, he says, and according to what agrees with the statement of Ptolemy, in this face there arises the thigh of a woman on a throne, and her two lower legs, and her feet, the head of Perseus, and part of his right palm, and the remainder of a hem of the woman who sees no husband, and her feet, and the triangle, and the head of Aries and its two horns, and the remainder of the flaxen thread which is in the curve, and the chest of Cetus. So again, he's pulling similar things from Tusar of Babylon, but filtered through Ptolemy's lens, okay? We're going to see this imagery come back in both the Picatrix and the 3 books of occult wisdom by Agrippa as well, in the images that they use to infuse talismans with power. So I want you to note that before we come back to that. So that is part of the Arabic period. Now we move on to the Sabians of Haran, and they were really important as a bridge for this knowledge coming down to us. They were they did work at one of 7 sacred sites, the Temple of the Moon, which is near what is now modern day Turkey. They were active around 600 to 1000 AD, and their studies and their preservation of knowledge allowed us to receive this wisdom through things like the Picatrix that we see here on the right, and allowed this knowledge to survive the Western Dark Ages. So around this period of time, Christianity and Islam were both spreading throughout the West, and they were seeking to eradicate any practices that didn't fit within their specific worldview. And one of the ways that the Harans, or the Sabians of Haran, were able to survive is they had to sort of declare their faith and then pay a tax to be able to continue to practice what they were practicing. But this was a really important little sort of oasis for this knowledge as other things were being lost to the annuals of time. So due to their efforts, we get this important 11th century magical grimoire that brings both images and instructions for utilizing the magical power of the Decans. And this is sort of reflected in the Egyptian Book of the Dead too, which is a book that reflects actual theological practices, okay? So actual prayers and magical workings, much like the Picatrix does. So the original name of this was the Gayat al-Hakim, which roughly translates to the goal of the sage or the goal of the wise. And here we see the version that is translated by John Michael Greer and Christopher Warnock. Now there's other translations that have come out, but this one has been a standard for quite a long period of time. And it is a preservation of ancient pagan magical practices. So what we'll do is we'll take an examination next of talismanic magic. So here we see a quote from Book 2, Chapter 11 of the Latin Picatrix. And it says, "When you make any of the images of the faces described above, Make them in a material appropriate to the planet that rules the face. Then the work will be as we have said. That is, if you make the image when the corresponding planet is present in that face, then the work will be perfect and it will manifest in the world. If it happens that the sun is rising in the hour of the planet or combines its force with it in a way that you desire, the work will be stable and strong. So that's a direct quote from the Picatrix. And here we're seeing some rules potentially for making a talisman. On the left, you'll see a picture of a talismanic ring that my partner made. You can check her out. Her name is Tanya Andrews at Third Coast Mojo on Instagram. And I have the ring next to me. This is a solar talismanic ring. I don't know if you can see this, but it is a Aries 2 decanic ring. So we'll take a look at the election for this in the next slide and sort of what we liked about the election and what might have been less than ideal. But here's a few simple rules. And now there is debate on the types of rules that people follow. And as much as there is debate on different astrological techniques that people use to find meaning. So don't take this as the be all end all of talismanic, creation rules. But in general, you want to get your target planet, in this case, the sun, in the desired decan. You don't want it to be combust, which means under the beams of the sun or invisible within 15 degrees of the sun. Some authors would say within 8 degrees of the sun. With the south node, which is a draining influence, or co-present with the malefic planets Saturn or Mars. We also don't want to see applying aspects from the malefics or to the malefics. If we are using a positive work, some parts of the Picatrix are, in all honesty, are not, there's sort of the reverse polarity. If you're trying to do sort of negative works, you might want to reverse some of those rules. We also want to see the sun rising on the ascendant or culminating on the MC during the hour of the target planet. So that, like we saw this in the Latin Picatrix here in their quote. Ideally, the moon also should be waxing, which means it's gaining in light and fast or above its average speed and forming a favorable aspect to a target planet if possible for positive or manifesting works. If you're trying to eliminate something, a waning moon might be more appropriate. At the appointed time, petition the spirits of the decan, engrave your metal or stone with the relevant image, or draw it on a piece of parchment, or assemble whatever it is that you're making, subfumigate it with the associated herbs. That's sort of like our little incense. So burn some incense, subfumigation. So here we see the ring being subfumigated with a candle, with herbs associated with the sun and things of that nature. We've got an image of the sun and all of these beautiful things happening here. There's a lot of talk about astrological magic being kind of an experimental art, and there's a lot of folks out there that are experimenting with different ways of doing it. I will just say this disclaimer. A lot of the way we think about astrological magic might be this thought of whether we are nudging fate in a certain direction. And we can contrast that with maybe a stoic acceptance of what comes to us in life. And there's definitely debate around that, even in my own household. I tend to lean more towards the stoic acceptance type of worldview, and my partner tends to lean more towards the nudging fate, let's create something type of worldview. And we have lots of debate and conversations regarding that, and I think that's healthy. And I think that we should all have some of those kind of discussions and debates about these things and be open and willing to listen to one another. So if we move forward here, we see, whoops, we've skipped right over it. Here is the Aries 2 election and the chart associated with it. So in Book 2, Chapter 11 of the Latin Picatrix, it says, there ascends in this second face of Aries a woman dressed in green clothes, lacking one leg. This is the face of high rank, nobility, wealth, and rulership. This is its form. Now, fascinating to point out that we see a woman dressed in green clothes. Now, Abu Mashar talked about a woman dressed in red clothes And in Agrippa, we also see a woman dressed in red clothes for the Decan of Aries too. Lacking one leg, that was reflected in the Abu Mashar passage we heard earlier. Since this is the Decan of the exaltation of the sun, the exaltation of the sun happens at roughly 18 to 19 degrees of Aries. We can think of the sun representing power, rulership, light, awareness, all of those different types of things that we might be trying to infuse into a body. So this talisman is sort of like that mummification process, right? We're infusing some kind of spirit or energy into a physical thing, just like soul is infused into our physical bodies. Okay. So, and people make talismans for all sorts of different reasons. I will point out that I think that some of the criticisms of astrological magic, as far as not wanting to mess with fate versus Stoic acceptance, can come from potentially positions of privilege. I think that historically, a lot of astrological magic was used by oppressed people. My partner practices, in addition to talismanic magic, has some hoodoo practices from her African-American heritage. And a lot of those hoodoo practices were played out to give people who are experiencing oppression a sense of power and agency. So I think that's something really to point out and to understand when we're looking at these, and if there's criticism for these practices. So here's what we're doing here in this election. We've got a ring, which in this case was yellow labradorite with saffron and high john root affixed under the stone. In the image is a woman with one leg that is reflected in the Picatrix, and the target word wealth was inscribed into the stone itself. It was subfumigated with myrrh and high john root. So if we're looking at this election and seeing what we like about it, and reflecting the rules that we looked at previously, this is an electional chart for April 5th, 2020, 7:14 p.m. a.m. Sorry, there's a typo at the bottom. It's 7:14 a.m. in Ypsilanti, Michigan, when the sun was rising over the horizon. So the target planet is in its own face. Now, this is a wheel from Astro Gold that is brand new, where you can see the decanic rulers reflected with the different signs. And I think that it's really interesting to be able to see that in connection with the planets. I love this new feature. And I did a video of this on my YouTube channel, Spencer Michaud Astrology, on how to use this along with the term ruler wheel. So check that out if you want. But we can see that the target planet, the sun, is in its own face, the face of the sun, on the ascendant, which was one of the rules that we wanted to follow. It is exalted. It has dignity. It also has rulership by triplicity. This election was in the day and hour of the target planet. So the day of the sun, which is Sunday, and the hour of the sun, which is the first hour of the day. There are no malefics co-present with the planet or forming any negative aspects, applying aspects to the malefics. Now, we do have malefics making a sextile by whole sign, but we're going to kind of let that go because it's not a negative applying aspect. The malefics aren't in any angular houses. This is something, if you're doing electional work in general, that you want to try to avoid. You don't want the Mars or Saturn in the 1st, 10th, 7th, or 4th houses, because that gives them extra power. This would be a bad election if we had Saturn and Mars in the 10th, which would be what is said to be called overcoming of the sun and exerting this negative influence on the sun, because it is earlier in the zodiac and sort of like chasing the sun down. That's a position that is really negative in Hellenistic astrology and can really feel like a blockage and create harm. So we also see in this election that the moon is waxing. The moon is in Virgo here, waxing. It has a lot of light. It's not completely full yet, because when the moon is directly opposite the sun, it was also thought to be sort of kind of under the beams of the sun, sort of being kind of burnt up a little bit, or under the bond is what I guess the technical term would be. So it is not completely full. And the moon is moving very fast. We like to have a fast moving moon if we're looking for manifestation types of things. And there's a little trick that you can figure out with this, where you can see how far away that the moon is from the lunar apogee or black moon Lilith, which I have displayed in this chart. And the further away it is, the faster it's going to be moving. The closer it is to that, the slower it's moving. That's a nice little trick that you can use to put into your chart. Now, a few things that may have been compromises or potentially seen as negative. In this case, I think the positives are probably a little bit more than the negatives, but the moon isn't necessarily aspecting the target planet. I don't know if that's necessarily a deal breaker for some people, but in this case, it was not. And the south node on the midheaven probably isn't exactly what you want to be doing. But again, there's always going to be compromises in elections. You just have to figure out what is going to be your intention, what you want to manifest, and if the negatives are going to outweigh the positives. And in this case, the creator of the talisman determined that the positives were enough to go through with the election. Now, again, a lot of this is experimental and we learn by practice, but I do think it is important before you start going down this path. I have some nervousness about this because I don't know enough astrological magic yet or the rules behind it. I rely on my partner for a lot of those things because she has a much more intense interest in that area of astrology. Really, I think it's important to take your time, to be patient, to do your homework, maybe do this under the guidance of some kind of teacher if you're going to experiment with this, because there can be some negative repercussions if you make a mistake. Okay. Let's see. How are we doing? Any relevant questions, Delia?
Yes, actually.
Okay.
Betty would like to know if you have a source that lists the fixed stars associated with each decan.
Yes. Let me think. I don't have a source for the Egyptian stars associated with each decan, but I'm assuming that in the Book of Nut, that is probably listed or outlined. I have a whole separate talk on fixed stars, an introduction to fixed stars that you can find on my YouTube channel, Spencer Michaud Astrology. And in that talk, I have a number of sources for fixed stars. The first one that pops into my mind was Bernadette Brady's book of fixed stars. And what you can do is you can kind of see where the fixed star is located and then make an assertion of where it is in the zodiac and which decan it's a part of. I mean, Austin Coppock's book, 36 Faces, talks about specific fixed stars in his book. I have so many sources. Diane Rosenberg has a really thorough examination of fixed stars. What else do I got? Oh, so many books. I'm sort of a little bit of a bibliophile. You'll always see me posting pictures of books and things of that nature. And Christopher Warnock has some material on this too. We use his book of fixed stars that talks about kind of the decans a little bit as well. So for a really thorough source examination, check out that talk on the fixed stars on my YouTube channel, but those are some good places to start. All right. Anything else?
Yeah, I just posted the link to your talk in the chat box.
Okay, sweet.
Okay, on the slide where you had Nemesis, the image of Nemesis, and you were talking about the deities associated with each decan, you showed a printout on the webcam. Do you have a link where people might access this list?
Maybe. What I would do is I searched on Google for Cosmos of Jerusalem, and I think you can find this at academia.com. Or there's an archive site where PDFs of certain historical documents are able to be downloaded. But COSMAS of Jerusalem is the document that you can find online. And if people can't find it, send me an email and I'll just send it to you, or I'll send you a link and I'll find that for you. I do think I have it downloaded as a PDF somewhere. And if not, I can even scan it if people are having difficulty finding it. But it's just a 2-page document. But again, some really valuable material in those 2 pages.
Thank you. I believe that's academia.edu. I
There you
typed it
go.
into the chat box as well.
Okay, sweet.
Okay.
All right.
Jennifer's asking if you have time for this, it's great. If not, that's fine. But can you repeat the Lilith determining the speed of the moon trick?
Yeah. So in this Aries 2 election, we see the little symbol that looks sort of like a little sickle with a cross. And that's the black moon Lilith, or the lunar apogee. And what I'm looking for, and this is a technique that was told to Tanya by Ursula Rising, who is an amazing astrological mage, and comes from a tradition of astrological magicians. So I wanted to shout them out here. So what we're seeing is the moon having distance from this point here. Okay, so if for example the moon was conjoined the lunar apogee, it would be very slow in motion. But since it is far away from this lunar apogee, black moon Lilith point, we can automatically assume that the moon is going to be fast in motion. So that's just a little visual trick if you're looking at elections. A slow moon generally isn't something that you want for manifestation talismans.
Thank you. Can you repeat the Instagram of your partner?
Yeah, so it's Tanya. There's two that they are active on. Tanya Andrews, TanjaAndrews. And so that's an Instagram handle. And then Third Coast Mojo is her magical offering site. And she has some electional material on there, like some oils and some bath salt type things and herbal blends and stuff like that. She's just getting started. She has a full-time job besides this, but really passionate about that work. And she just recently joined me on a live stream that I did on my channel for the new moon in Cancer, and talks a little bit about astrological magic and what she does too. So if you go to my channel, Spencer Michaud Astrology, you can kind of see her wisdom in action. She's really, really smart and amazingly well-spoken, a fountain of knowledge as well. And just a really nice person. I'm biased, but yeah, she's great. And she really does a lot of homework with this type of stuff, and yeah, check her out, support her work.
Thank you, Spencer. Just one last question.
Yeah.
Is there any connection between Abu Mashar and the Sabian symbols?
That's an interesting question. Maybe. I think I have a note in here about that somewhere, but it's buried deep in like 25 pages of notes. I believe that Mark Edmund Jones was referencing some kind of list from, I don't know if it was Alan Leo or Ptolemy. I know that those two things are very different, but Mark Edmund Jones had a list of these types of symbolic associations, and then brought a different every degree of the zodiac to this mystic, Elsie Wheeler, I think her name was, and had her do like this kind of channeling experience to get these images. I'm not sure if there's a direct connection with the Sabians and those Sabian symbols, specifically because Mark Edmund Jones had a seer channel these things in the beginning of the 20th century or the late 19th century. But who knows? Maybe this person was channeling some of that wisdom from that ancient place, from that ancient wisdom. I mean, I think there's a lot of ways to receive information. And I think that the Sabian symbols sort of are in the spirit of these decanic images, because they give us a way of thinking about the different areas of the zodiac that's more kind of granular and focusing in on a specific area. And I've actually found some interesting correlations with them. I think that with any of these techniques, the key is in training yourself to them. When you learn a system, when you use that system repeatedly, you sort of are like a radio receiver that is tuning in to the channel that the divine wants to speak to you through. And that's the essence of divination. And I think astrology can be like that too. I know that there's some people that say that astrology is the ultimate objective truth. And I don't necessarily think that that's true. I think that there's all sorts of subjectivity that is present within it. I think that there may be some kind of universal eye chart out there somewhere, but we're always going to be filtering it through these subjective lenses of consciousness and culture. So yeah. One, I guess to make a point with the Sabian symbols, I believe the sun, my sun's at 15 degrees Cancer, and I believe the Sabian symbol for that one is like a man studies an ancient mandala intensely. And I mean, look at what we're doing here. Here's the ancient mandala right in front of us, you know, the circle of the zodiac. And unfortunately, my moon is at the degree that talks about the Sabian symbol. An old man uses an ancient book but fails to interest his students. So I don't know if that, hopefully this is interesting and I'm not just howling into the void, but yeah, I think there is some wisdom within those. And if that's something that you use, I have a friend I'm in a book club with that uses them to great effect. And they may even be here today. Say hi to my friend Lisa. All right. Any other questions?
No, just wanted to say you're not an old man.
Okay. Sometimes I feel old, but you know, it's all relative, isn't it? All right, let's move forward. So here we are talking about the medieval and Renaissance period. In this image, we're seeing the Palazzo Schifanoia in Ferrara in Italy. So this was a palatial estate that had some of the decanic images on its walls. So as our journey of the Decans continues, astrology itself starts to migrate to Western Europe from the Middle East via the Crusades. So we had people trying to spread Christianity, and they tried to conquer these other, you know, Middle Eastern countries, and then, you know, they were influenced and brought back with them some of this information. Whether they understood it or not, who can say? But a lot of these images appeared on some of the artwork on different various buildings of this time frame. So we can also see these images in you know, alluded to, right? That's sort of like referenced in both the Vatican and the Sistine Chapel. So it's really fascinating to see that these images have held a fascination over multiple centuries and multiple cultures, and they just keep popping up in different places. So there were two really important works to come out of this period that reference the Decans. The first one is Guido Benadi's Libre Astronomier. And this outlines a way of understanding the Decans via essential dignity. Now, this is really important because this is sort of, I believe, you know, not the first, because we saw this a little bit with Tusser, but it's the first author that I think describes it in its function. And it's a little bit different than the way Hellenistic authors describe dignity. I would say that Hellenistic authors give different roles to essential dignities, and they don't really think of them as being scored. You know, in this period of time, you could see authors assigning like a point system to different dignities, like 5 points for a planet being in its own domicile, 4 for exaltation, and etc. I believe Decan would get 1 point. It was a minor dignity. And we'll look at this and how they described it. So in this Liber Astronomiae, the book of astronomy, Benadi says, dignity by house is likened to one own's proper business, while dignity by exaltation is likened to honors or dignities, as much of those coming from strange or unusual sources as those coming from inheritances. Dignity by face is likened to one who is in a foreign land, with no family of their own, yet through their own skill and virtue makes a name for themselves. Now that's kind of neat, because this really describes maybe the Decans operating under the person's personal agency and power. Now in the Hermetica, okay, which was a book of ancient wisdom that was possibly referencing old Egyptian culture as well. We see that kind of that spherical model of the universe come down to us. And in that book, I believe in a book called Strobaeus, number 7, they talk about the sphere of the Decans being outside the sphere of the fixed stars in the zodiac. We have the concentric rings of the planets surrounding the Earth that we talked about with Chaldean Order, and then the fixed stars in the zodiac outside of that. But the Decans were described as being completely outside all of that. And maybe, here's just a radical thought, potentially the Decans may reflect something that is outside of fate. And I know this is a sort of a kind of a provocative statement, but that would make sense as far as why these astrological magicians or talismanic magicians would be using the Decans to create talismans, because it is the ability to work outside the machinations of destiny and fate, and be able to have, be able to make a name for yourself through your own skill, through your own virtue. I thought that was really fascinating and something worth further consideration. The next book that we have here is from Henry Cornelius Agrippa, which is called The 3 Books of Occult Philosophy. Now, this is similar to the Picatrix, and it was, published in 1525. It's a very important magical text that gave us a lot of these techniques, and another important, bridge for ancient pagan practices. And he has some references to some of the ancient sources. So here Agrippa in 3 Books says, there are besides in the zodiac 36 images, according to the number of faces of the like, as Porphyry says, Teucer of Babylon long since wrote, who was a most ancient mathematician, after whom the Arabians also wrote of these things. So Agrippa is tracing this back, much as we have done in this talk, from to Teucer, to Abu Mashar, down the line. And here we're finding it again in Benadi and Agrippa. So I wanted to really make and emphasize the point that there is a lineage for these Decans that we can trace all the way back to Egypt and to some of these original understandings. So it's pretty cool. In the 3 books of occult wisdom by Agrippa, they're very similar to the Arabic images. They don't necessarily mention a spirit or a god name. They're mostly just literal images. We could see that in Agrippa. I'll read this for you. I read Aries 2 so we can kind of just understand how similar it is to Abu Mashar. So for Aries 2, it says, let me find, okay. In the second face of Aries ascends the form of a woman, outwardly clothed with a red garment, and under it a white spreading abroad over her feet. And this image causes nobleness, height of a kingdom, and greatness of dominion. So again, we see that woman clothed in a red or a green garment, and it's repeated. And I think that some of these images inform some of the Rider-Waite Tarot images as well, because we'll see that in the card associated with Aries 2, which is the 3 of Wands. And if I show you real quick, I don't know if you could see my face here or not, but in the 3 of Wands, you could see a figure looking out into a bay, leaning against wands, and look at that. They're wearing both a red and a green cloak. So I think that maybe, Pamela Coleman Smith or Arthur Waite was like, you know what, we got these multiple sources. Let's put a little bit of each in that garment to as a nod to both of these sources. So I thought that was kind of cool. All right, if we move on to the Enlightenment period. Now, this is a time when astrology started kind of going underground. Around the 16th century, we have these scientific breakthroughs of our understanding of the physical universe. We have Newtonian physics and gravity and our understanding of that. And, Newton got hit in the head with the apple, and Newton was a pretty amazing person with working with prisms and things of that nature. And then we have Copernicus talking about the heliocentric model of the cosmos. Here we have a painting by Jan Matejko, where I thought that this painting is the most ironic thing ever, because it's a conversation with God. And this conversation with God he had potentially led to what could be considered a desouling of the cosmos, where, you know, we've got things like his theories influencing philosophers like Rene Descartes and a mechanized universe. You know, it kind of took us out of the center of the universe, maybe a humbling on some level. And, you know, it started leading to some of the actions that brought about the Industrial Revolution, because we thought of the universe as this mechanized thing without a soul that just ran like a machine. You know, it was harder for people to connect with the stars, and it led to a lot of doubt regarding the validity of astrology. So this is kind of that period where we're going, you know, underground, and kind of losing touch with this kind of lineage that we can see when we start to trace it back. So we do have some literature referencing the Decans in this period, but it's not very much. We do have William Lilly that refers to them briefly, like Benadi did as a minor form of dignity. And William Lilly was sort of the last great classical astrologer. And you know, after that, the you know, astrology went underground. It was basically repressed. It was, you know, people were like, well, we have this new thing called science. That geocentric, you know, cosmological model was false. So all of this astrology must be false as well. And I think that what they're missing is that, you know, astrology is geocentric because it is from the perspective of the person standing on the earth. And we're seeing the symbols, you know, reflected in the rising of stars and decans, the movement of the planets, the relative speeds. And it's all based on our lens from Earth. Now, many people could argue, well, what would happen if you moved astrology to Mars? Well, there might be something focused on that reference point, you know. So it's interesting to think about that and how it might be different. Okay. Any questions on that, Delia, that I'm missing?
No, we can move on.
Okay. All right, so here we see the rose cross of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So this is a time period when astrology starts to reemerge in the late 19th century, thanks in part to both Alan Leo, astrological almanacs and magazines being published, and the Theosophical movement, which was a tradition that drew from various wisdom traditions like ancient Egypt, like, you know, the Indian tradition, the magical tradition. All of these different kind of things were kind of, you know, mixed up in this hodgepodge. And we had this spiritualist movement that was, you know, giving rise to occultism. I think this was a reaction to the mechanized universe. A lot of the times when you see something in the collective given rise, you know, the universe is going to try to bring it into homeostasis and bring it back into balance. And I think that there was this kind of this underground interest in this stuff because people were starting to feel that lack because of you know, some of the, I don't know, the tragedies of the Industrial Revolution and you know, colonialism and things of that nature. So in this period of time, the Decans were largely stripped of their traditional meanings, but treated as modifiers of signs, similar to the way that the Vedic astrologers assign dignity via triplicity. So, you know, this is coming from Alan Leo a little bit. Now, Alan Leo is a polarizing figure in astrology. He did, you know, we can credit him a lot with being able to reintroduce astrology and, you know, uncover it from the catacombs of life. But he also changed a lot of the structure of it to avoid, you know, being put in jail and to avoid persecution. So he kind of started taking this like more psychological type of approach, this more, dare I say, evolutionary approach, where it was less about fatalism and more about like, you know, this is just part of your personality or something like that. And some of that we can think about that particular cultural lens. Some of it may have been also detrimental to the study of astrology because it was almost like creating a completely new system. And we had this beautiful ordered system that came down to us for, you know, roughly, you know, 2,000 years intact. And then it just, you know, it was being changed. You know, the intact version is in the Indian tradition. The broken version is the one we get in the West. So we are seeing now that, you could say like, oh, you're an Aries, but you're a Leo type Aries, similar to that triplicity system. So there was a number of secret societies that started popping up, but one very important one was the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. So this was a society that definitely played quite a pivotal role in the lens that we view the Decans through now. By drawing upon these ancient decanic images that we've seen throughout history, the spirits as well as material from the Lesser Key of Solomon and the Kabbalah, two members in particular, mystic Arthur Edward Waite and the artist Pamela Coleman Smith, created an iconic tarot deck that we see used predominantly today called the Rider-Waite Smith tarot deck. So this was a really important moment for the Decans and the images and the narratives that they were projecting. So let's talk about the tarot and its syncretization with the Decans and kind of break down how that system works, because I think this is really fascinating. And I'm kind of giving you the teach a person to fish type of thing rather than just giving you a specific thing. We'll get to more specifics in the next slide here. But so this is the Rider-Waite Smith deck, and I've got one right next to me here. This is the deck that I use. I just like the original deck. I have a few other decks, and there's some interesting images that come onto that. And if you resonate with different decks, that's cool. But there's a lot of symbolism that's infused in this particular one. And I think at least having a basic knowledge of this particular deck is really important if you want to be able to kind of, play jazz later. Like it's kind of like learn some music theory, learn, your scales, and then you can improvise and riff and add things in. So the Rider-Waite Smith deck consists of 78 cards divided into 22 major arcana that are without suits. So things like the magician, the fool, the hermit, those are the major arcana. And we have 56 minor arcana that are further divided into 16 court cards and 4 suits of 10 cards each. When we remove the 4 aces, we're left with the 36 decanic cards numbered 2 through 10. So we do have additional names and significations that were later provided by the Golden Dawn's Book T, which you'll see later referenced in my decanic flashcards, and Aleister Crowley's Book of Thoth. So if we're looking for a system that we can use to understand the tarot and the Decans, each suit is attributed to the 4 classical elements. So we have the fire signs, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, reflected in the cards of the wands or the suit of wands. The earth signs, Capricorn, Taurus, and Virgo, in the suit of pentacles. Air signs, Libre, Aquarius, and Gemini with swords. And then the water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, syncretized with the cards of cups. Each mode corresponds to a certain set of numbers. The cardinal signs, Aries, Capricorn, Libra, and Cancer, will be always reflected with the numbers 2, 3, and 4. Okay, I've got Roman numerals here because it's important to start understanding them via Roman numeral because that's how they appear on the cards. The fixed signs, Leo, Taurus, Aquarius, and Scorpio, will be numbered 5, 6, and 7. And the mutables, Sagittarius, Virgo, Gemini, and Pisces, 8, 9, and 10. So this is kind of a code that you need to crack to be able to say, okay, I know which decan this is. If you say, I've got the 8 of cups, all right, 8 is a mutable sign. Okay, it is the mutable water sign, cups is water, must be Pisces. So we have the first decan of Pisces is the 8 of cups. Okay. So here we see an angular triad. Now this is some kind of a revisiting of some material that I did in a talk called Tarot and the Thema Mundi for the Great Lakes Astrology Conference a few years ago. I had a certain level of understanding at this point, but this has been a really interesting way to approach decanic tarot. And here, a few background things before we dive into this. So the Thema Mundi is the philosophical natal chart of the world. It has Cancer on the ascendant for the reasons we specified with the return of the floodwaters to the Nile when Sirius was rising. Sirius is in the sign or close to the sign of Cancer. We also have kind of these significations with planetary joys potentially adding some layers of meaning, and primary and secondary motion and the concepts of daimon and tuke. So angular triads are a set of 3 houses that are grouped together to be able to give a certain narrative. So here we see that the angular triad of the ascendant, and in clockwise motion, okay, we have the primary motion of the sun is going to pull whatever planet is in that house away from this angle or kentron, which was said to be a place of power. So these cadent houses are being pulled away from the angle, and these succedent houses are being pulled into the angle. So we've got a planet that is wanting to move by secondary motion. That is the zodiacal motion. We have primary motion happens over the course of a 24-hour period. Secondary motion is happening over a longer period of time. So we've got this push and this pull, this yin and the yang of the zodiac, right? And the planet is wanting to go into the angle in this cadent house, but is being pulled away from it, okay? We can also think of the cadent houses as being preceding the sign that was in the angle previously and now is being pulled away. So this could be like almost the past, whereas we have the future for the succedent and the present for the angular house. So that's some background on how to read these angular houses. And with the angle of the ascendant, we have the union of body and soul, which is reflected in the story of Cancer. So here we see the 3 decanic narratives of Cancer with the 2 of Cups, the union of body and soul here. We have the nurturing that takes place to bring something into fruition with the 3 of Cups and the 3 graces. These were the attendants of the Greek gods. I mean, I believe that they were, being able to provide what was necessary for people like Aphrodite and Zeus and things like that. And then we have like this 3rd card here, the 4 of Cups, where someone is refusing the excess. Okay, so we have different names for these cards too. So with the 2 of Cups, we have love. Now these names are coming from Book T and the Book of Thoth. Like you have the Lord of Love or the Lord of Abundance. Okay, so we have the Lord of Love, the Lord of Abundance, and the Lord of Luxury. Now there are slight variations between Book T and Book of Thoth, and you can see that later in the work that I will show. But this is, everything is kind of centered around this experience. Now, if I were to just kind of give you a brief explanation of the Gemini cards here, this is reflective of the 12th house of the cosmos. And this is, you could see this, sometimes we're thinking, well, why are the 12th house cards? Sorry about I don't know if you're getting sirens in the background. I apologize for that. It's very 12th house. Like the Gemini cards reflect sort of what looks like a negative experience, right? We've got the 8 of Swords here. Remember, 8 is mutable cards, and swords are air, so Gemini is a mutable air sign. We have the Lord of Interference, and the 12th house being the joy of Saturn, and also potentially connected to the myth of where you are choosing a life, where you are cast lots and you're choosing a life. And there may be anxiety about choice. And I think some of the significations with Gemini in general are this kind of exploration of choice and feeling bound by choice. So with this decan, okay, Gemini 1, we may feel bound by the proliferation of choices that we have to make. And that may lead to the self-undoing of the 12th house and the existential crisis that people experience within that house. I have the 12th house sun, and my life is one existential crisis after another, a questioning of what is better? What do I do? Where's the right direction to go? And as you move forward, you can also see that we have sort of a repetition of modes when we go from one card to the next. So we have the cardinal energy in the first decan, like kind of outlining what the card is going to be about, what the sign is going to be about. We have sort of the process that is going to happen in the second card, like the fixed kind of thing. We have the cardinal in the first, the fixed, and then the mutable being maybe the result of what's going to happen. So in the Gemini story, and I talk about this a lot on my channel, You may be faced with a choice. You may have anxiety and you may stay up at night deliberating over that choice. And then finally, in the third decan, which Austin Coppock calls the executioner's sword, you have to make a sacrifice. You have one option has to be let go of so that another can live. And this is reflected in the myth of Gemini with Castor and Pollux, where one twin is slain and the other has to give up some of his immortality so that his brother can live again. And this is something I counsel Gemini, people with planets in Gemini 3. I counsel them with the need to make a choice. And there is some of the suffering that they may experience is through being unwilling to let go of something and infuse life into something else. And that may be part of the self-undoing that they're experiencing. Now, if we briefly look at the story of Leo, we've got this associated with kind of the gate of Hades, is which this second house is called, where we're leaving the underworld and returning to life, and we're our body is returned to us, our possessions are returned to us. And there may be some competition over resources and finding our authenticity after we've been infused into a body. We are trying to gain the support of others. The second house was also associated with your second, or people that support you. You know, cadent signs are supporting the angles, whereas, succedent signs are supporting the angle, while cadent signs are pulling power away from it. So when we get to the third card, we see someone who is defending a territory. Maybe there are resources where there's competition and you have to defend what you have acquired. So kind of, we've got this kind of like this narrative from one to the next. I have the ascendant in the third decan of Leo, and a lot of this is a Mars-ruled decan, and a lot of this we'll see reflected in the chart of the moment. A lot of my life has been having to deal with some conflict and figuring out whether I could be true to my path and defend my path. I started out as a professional musician and had to defend that choice to my family who didn't understand it. And then I, went off and did something else weird, like astrology, right? I mean, it's becoming more accepted, but when you tell your family, oh, I'm a musician and now I'm going to be an astrologer, it's like you have to deal with maybe disapproval and then fight for that sense of authenticity and that sense of identity. So I think that there's some really interesting correlations that you can make when you see planet in a particular decan, or regarding the angular triad as well. So if we move forward to the next, I wanted to show you, I'll go through these angular triads. I hope I have time to do that. Here's the angular triad of the midheaven, where we see Aries at the top and reflected in these cards of praxis or action. These cards talk about creating your own world and being able to take the actions that bring honor and rank and dignity. And we saw that reflected in the Aries 2 solar talisman ring that we saw earlier. The goal of that is to bring to prominence or bring a sense of sovereignty, might be one of the goals of that particular ring, right? We see connected with this the story of Pisces and the 8, 9, and 10 of Cups, and the story of Taurus reflected in the 5, 6, and 7 of Pentacles. Now, I really like the Pisces one for this theory, because Pisces is the 9th house in general, is the exaltation, is the joy of the sun. So finding spiritual, divine meaning. We also have it as a cadent house from the 10th, which means that it either came before action or it is pulling us away from public action. So with the 8 of Cups, we see a figure that is leaving behind material success and going off in search of a higher spiritual purpose and a higher spiritual meaning. And that reflects, I think, the energy of the 9th house, which was associated with pilgrimages that people took to be able to find higher meaning. It wasn't just long distance travel, it was travel for a purpose. Whereas 3rd house travel was related to the moon and like travel that you would do over the course of your daily routine. So here we find satisfaction in the second card with a figure that has found meaning. And ultimately, we may have to make a sacrifice in this Mars-ruled card, the 10 of Cups, to be able to attain this very idealized version of the scene that is playing out with the rainbow and the happy family. This is maybe the goal that we're experiencing here. So, with the Taurus cards here in the 11th house was the joy of Jupiter. We are seeing in the middle decan here the quality of charity and of somebody in power giving alms to the poor. Now, one of the significations of the 11th house in horary is that the 11th house is the second derived house from the 10th, which was represented the government. So this could be money from the government, money from people in power, benefactors. So we see that reflected in the 6 of Pentacles card. All right, I'm going to go a little quicker through some of these. Any questions so far on that, Delia?
No, we're good to go.
Okay. So if we look at the angular triad associated with the descendant of the Thema Mundi, or of the cosmos, we see something reflected on, this is basically the reflection of the Capricorn experience, which is ruled by Saturn, and is the exaltation of Mars, the two malefic planets that are the antithesis of life. So we have something where we are perhaps contracting, perhaps we are trying to figure out a balance between ourselves and the other, which is another signification of the 7th house. This one was a hard one for me, the Capricorn one in general. I think that was the hardest for me to place as far as this theory goes. But in this card, we see the balance and trying to strike the balance of the advantages and disadvantages of a certain place or location. And we move forward into cooperating with others to build something. And in the 3rd decan of Capricorn, we are trying to administrate the power of the material structures that we have built. I do think that the 8th and 6th house really do reflect the meanings of these houses quite well. In the 8th house, we do see another gate of Hades, the entrance to the underworld, where we are seeing what is happening potentially after completion or after death. We have some sort of conflict. Maybe it's the conflict of life itself. And then we are being ferried across the river Styx into the underworld in the 2nd card of Aquarius, and bringing with us the wisdom that we gained from this mummification into a body, right? This embalming experience, and leaving behind what is no longer serving us, the physical form. We're taking with us the essence, leaving behind the form. We see that reflected in the 3rd decan of Aquarius. I think this really reflects the 8th house. I think that we also have the 8th house associated with legacies and that are inheritances that are passed on. And this could be what is collected after death from a relative or something like that, as we are looking back and reflecting on that life that was lived. And then in the 6th house, we have the Sagittarian cards, the mutable fire signs, associated with the joy of Mars. And we have Speed is the name of the 8 of Wands, which talks about a hasty motion that may lead potentially to an injury. The 6th house being the house of bad fortune, where you're trying to maybe defend something. Mars could be a principle of having the courage to defend your territory or to carry on. And also potentially the burden of carrying a heavy load. 6th house in ancient astrology was also associated with slavery or with actions that you took that you didn't get credit for, that like heavy loads that you had to carry, where you just kind of, you were barn eager, right? And think about this as the barn eager is one of my favorite words. That's like when a horse is, on a long journey and is very close to its home, within a mile of its home, it gets an extra boost of energy, right? My partner has the sun in this decan, and man, I'll tell you what, she can carry quite a heavy burden, especially emotionally, having to deal with me. But I think it's really fascinating to see that this is what happens prior to completion, is we are having to carry that load to get home, to get to that completion energy of the seventh house and the descendant and of death itself, so that we can have that rest and that return of the light, maybe again in the winter solstice. All right. And finally, on the IC, the lower heavens, we see Scorpio, Libra, and Virgo reflected. And here in the Libra house, the angular house, we see a figure that we could think of as a gatekeeper. Now, this figure has been likened to Mot and the Uranus. Okay, so that's the daimon or spirit of this decan, the Uranus, the kind of the arbitrators of justice, right? You know, the story of Mot was basically like in your entrance to the underworld, you had your heart weighed against the weight of the feather. And it was sort of like, are you bringing with you anything from that past life? And you have to be able to release all of these things. And potentially here it's reflected in that image of the heart and the three swords piercing it, because it's kind of, sometimes it's sad to go through and let go and release some of the pains and sorrows that we experience over the course of a lifetime. But eventually we come to rest, and we have this place of rest, this underground tomb here that we see reflected in the Four of Swords. We'll see that reflected in our chart of the day with the moon. Austin Coppock, likened that decan to a gyroscope. Nemesis was restoring right proportion in this decan. And here we have like this chaos that is maybe revolving around us, where we have to become the calm, peaceful center. Right? This is where we're away from the hustle and bustle of the world, and we're finding rest, we're finding peace, we're finding that fourth house rooted type of experience, right? In the cadent house that we see here, that preceded, okay, that is pulling us away from this rest, we see labor in the first decan of Virgo. We see craftsmanship. We are trying to get to this experience at the end of Virgo where we are leaving a legacy. And we need to have this experience of deciding what stays and what goes before we come to completion. What are we going to pass on before we get to, this period of rest, this underworld experience? And in the fifth house, we see this sense of loss, really, in this first card of Scorpio. We have the joy of Venus here, which is also reflected in potentially the choices that's presented in the Seven of Cups, and maybe the temptations that we are given in this spiritual or this physical experience. We also have it reflected in the second decan, potentially passing on of a legacy to our children. This is one of the significations of the fifth house is what comes after our deaths. What are we going to leave behind? Maybe it is this experience of our wisdom that we're giving to the next generations. And you can see this reflected in a figure giving a cup filled with flowers to a small child. All right. So integration. I'm going to stop here for a minute. Any questions on that, Delia?
Not on this section, though.
Okay. So how do we integrate all of these things together? Well, like I said, it takes patience and practice. At the beginning of my journey of understanding with the decans, I was introduced to this through Austin Coppock's book, which I know is out of print right now. We're waiting for him to reprint it. Hopefully he was able to do that so more people can have this material. I was lucky enough to get a copy that came from his garage, where he was like, I found a new box of these, and I was like, oh, great. I've been waiting for 6 months, and it was been out of stock. And I was lucky enough to get a copy. And I got to meet Austin at the United Astrology Conference, and he signed my book. And it was really cool. He's a wonderful, excellent writer who just has a really unique way of manipulating language. And he's just an artist, and I'm a huge super fan. But what I did is I took his book and I read a chapter for each decan as the moon was transiting through, roughly, I believe, every 3 days for the moon or so, something like that. It was moving. Yeah, it was moving quickly through a decan. And so I would record my thoughts in my journal, my impressions, as I was reading these chapters. and recording my thoughts in a lunar journey. So that was my Cancerian way of going through this and getting firsthand experience of what these decans were like. And then, much like T. Susan Chang in her book 36 Secrets, which is also an awesome book and a nice book to have as folks wait for the new edition of 36 Faces, and a great work on its own. She's coming more from the tarot perspective rather than the decan perspective, which is cool to see them, compared to one another. So what they did is T. Susan Chang chronicled their decan experience throughout an entire year by doing what she called a decan walk. And I did my own sort of decan walk by making a set of decanic flashcards for each traditional planet as it ingressed into a new decan. So I combined all of these different lenses we've been talking about, the face rulers with the Chaldean and triplicity ruler, the tarot card, the name from the Book T and the Book of Thoth, Austin Coppock's name, the daimon or spirit, and then the prominent fixed stars, mostly from a list from Bernadette Brady's book on fixed stars. The really bright ones, or the ones that have astrological meaning, I believe there's 48 of them that are referenced in Anonymous 379, which is like a ancient document on the fixed stars. So I kept making these little decan flashcards here, mostly for my own education, but then I shared them on my social medias and did a little kind of a reflection on each one. So for the Sun in Decan 3, I combined the significations of the Sun, the significations of the card, the significations of the spirit, to kind of distill it into something that I hope could help people. It says the Sun in the third decan of Libre brings us an awareness of the necessary steps to maintain our quiet center amidst the chaos of the moment. Take a time out from conflict and check excesses to help restore balance and regain vitality. So the nemesis part is about restoring balance. Regaining vitality is referencing the Sun and its ability to bring vitality. And then we have the rest from strife reflected in the card itself. Early in my journey of decans, I wrote an article on my page from roughly 3 years ago now called The Visual Astrologer, Exploring the Decans Through the Rider-Waite Tarot, where I outlined some of the realizations I was having as my mind was being blown reading Austin Coppock's book for the first time. And I made this decan correspondence table. Now, this is just a little piece of it so that you could see it, but in this early table, I put the name of the decan, the image from Austin's book, the tarot card, the names from Thoth and Book T, and the ruling Chaldean planet. Now, if I had to make this over again, I would put both the Chaldean and the triplicity planet, and I would add the fixed stars and the daimon to it. But you can find these on my Instagram at Spencer Michaud. There's a whole bunch of them if you go past. I did this with the fixed stars too, to help me learn about the fixed stars. I forced myself to do something public. And this is a great way to learn something. Some of us respond well by learning something in private. Others of us respond well by the fear of embarrassment. So I think that one of my reactions is that if I know that I am accountable to somebody, I'm definitely going to put the effort in so that I'm not telling somebody something that could potentially be incorrect or potentially could be embarrassing to me as a Leo ascendant. That's the worst thing. You don't want to be embarrassed. So it's really just setting yourself a pattern of accountability so that you can do your work and learn these things. And one thing I will say, when I first started doing decanic flashcards, I didn't have the daimons or spirits in there, and I didn't have the triplicity rulers. I just had the Chaldean rulers. So you can add layers in as you come to more understanding. Every lens that you're looking through has its own huge, enormous history, so, it takes a long time to learn this stuff. There's a reason why astrologers studied for years and years and years before starting to practice in the past. And sometimes you might get a kernel of truth from one particular lens, and sometimes you might get one from making adjustments and looking at it from a different angle. All right. So in one of the last slides we have here, we are analyzing a chart. So we're talking about how to integrate it into practice, but let's look at a chart to figure out how we might do this in all different types of client work. Now, that you can use this in natal readings, you can use this in transit readings, you can use it in horary, you can use it with electional charts and talismanic magic charts. It is, you can find value with this type of technique in any type of astrology that you can do, in my personal opinion. So I like to say on my channel that the chart offers both the challenge and the solution. Now, that's interesting because sometimes, the solution is acceptance. Okay. It doesn't mean that there's always something that you can do. Sometimes the solution is endurance. So I wanted to preface that statement with that, is that sometimes there are things that are bigger than us, that are outside of our control, that require surrender. And in all honesty, we may actually be able to see that reflected in the chart as well. But one thing that our teacher Achyuta Bhava here likes to talk about is that we are not our chart. Our chart is a reflection of a set of planetary influences on us, and we can choose whether to respond or not to those influences. Now, there is a longer debate we could have on whether we do have, what level of choice we have, but that is a topic for another day. But I think that we do have a little bit of agency. I feel like we have slightly less than when I started working with Achyuta, but that's I think that is the humility that comes with age and with wisdom, is knowing that there are some things that are bigger than you, and that you will have to accept that there are limitations that we do face in life. So in my method, I always begin by asking focus questions for the session. I really think that a reading should be a conversation between you and the client, and that a chart can tell you so many things that if you're just trying to go in cold, you're wasting time. So I asked the clients to send me at least 3 focus questions for our session, so that we can really kind of try to get into that oracular space and let the chart speak to us to that specific issue that they're having. Because, astrology isn't about just demonstrating your acumen. That's just ego. It's really about service. And that's the way I approach it, is how do we serve the client? So I then analyze the sect of the chart to determine whether it is a day or night chart. So in this particular chart of the beginning of our talk today, we have a day chart because the sun is at the top of the horizon here in the 10th house, in an angular spot in the 3rd decan of Cancer. And we'll talk about that in a minute. I note the decan for each point in the chart that I find relevant, the ascendant, the MC, and each of the 7 traditional planets. Now, sometimes I'll analyze other parts like the north and the south node, or the descendant, or something of that nature. It just depends on what the question is. I don't normally analyze the decans for the outer planets, but you can do that. It still works. I do that in my forecasts, so I definitely use it. I note their dignity, their house placement, and then I pull the tarot cards that correspond to use as visual cues with the client. I think this is one of the biggest values of this technique, is giving a narrative, a story for people to be able to meditate on. I found time and time again that the stories in the tarot and in the decanic stories will be reflected quite literally in the lives of people that they are playing out with. For example, I had a client whose Mars is in the 3rd decan of Aquarius, which is syncretized with the 7 of Swords, that card we looked at with the figure taking the swords and leaving a particular place. So this was in her 3rd house of siblings, and it was a kind of a challenging Mars for this person. They had a really abusive sibling who was very violent and caused them a lot of distress. And Austin Coppock calls that decan the knot, like a karmic knot that you have to untangle, where it's hard to remove yourself from that circumstance. And in the consultation, I talked about Mars's role potentially to sever and to separate. So here is the chart giving us a challenge, but again, offering a solution. And in her case, the solution was severing and cutting ties from that sibling to prevent future abuse. And through that realization, she was able over time, and like with help of therapists and things of that nature, to remove herself from that abusive situation. Also, interestingly enough, at the end of a Mars profection year, her abusive sibling passed away. So that was reflected in being, the universe removing that person from their life as well. All right. I also examine the daimon of a decan and look up the archetypal meaning of the myth surrounding the spirit of the decan and any fixed stars that the planet is near. I then look at which houses the planets rule, their hosts, and any aspects they're making. This was something that was really was a light bulb moment for me, just in a way of thinking about the relationship between a planet and its host, was from another Nightlight astrology speaker, Martin Hermes, where he discussed that the planet in the sign is thought of as the potter, and the planet that is providing for that planet, the host, is the clay. And you want to look at the quality of the clay that is being provided for the potter. So, for example, in our chart here, we have the sun in the 10th. That is trying to take action in this chart, trying to create and individuate through the 10th house of action. So this is sort of a fortunate placement for the sun in this particular chart of this talk. And it is being provided clay from the moon in the first house in the third decan of Libre. So we are trying to infuse and potentially deal with excess in the third decan of Cancer. So as you can probably tell, and Delia said in the beginning, I have a lot of thoughts on this. And I had to, throughout this talk and throughout my research, figure out what is the most important thing and what do I need to leave behind. I have an abundance of information. What do I do to deal with the excess and the luxury? You could see that reflected in the figure in the Four of Cups that is refusing the extra cup from Spirit. And the clay that is being provided was that Four of Swords experience, where today we are trying to be the center of in what may be chaotic situations going around us. And you could already tell that I live on a street that is very close to a fire station. And in the middle of the talk, there were sirens, going on all around me. And I had to be calm in the face of that, whatever that chaos was around. So that could have been feeding energy to the sun. And we also have a first quarter moon square here. So we have a physical crisis that happens at the first quarter moon. So if you could think about this as like thinking about this talk, but also imagine if there was a baby born at the moment my talk started, and there probably was, this would be their natal chart. This would be their life that we're examining. So they may have a drive to take action out in the world. Remember that praxis. Okay, but they may also have a sense of luxury, but also lack. So here's the integration with this. So before I get to that, the client's experience of this decanic narrative can vary greatly by the condition and intention of the specific planet. Robert Schmidt, who we talk about a lot in our Nightlight courses here, outlined some basic planetary intentions in his Project Hindsight lectures. The sun selects, illuminates, individuates. The moon collects. It is associated with the body and the environment that you're working through. 2K, fortune. Mercury, he says, it destabilizes, contests, and questions things. Venus reunifies that which is separate, brings together and harmonizes, while Mars severs, separates, and splits apart that which is alike or together. Jupiter confirms, stabilizes, bridges, and brings order. Okay, think of Jupiter as the demiurge that is drawing upon the blueprint of Saturn. Saturn also exiles, deprives, abandons, and casts out. So these are directly from Robert Schmidt from Project Hindsight. So we can see in this chart, the sun is selecting through its experience that quality of luxury and excess. Now, the daimon associated with the third decan of Cancer is Hecate. And Hecate was sort of a dual goddess that both gave life and took it away, reflecting the lunar kind of journey of coming to fullness and then, disseminating its light. So I have Mercury in this decan, and this is if you talk about what Mercury does, it questions and contests. And for me personally, with my Mercury in this decan, whenever I receive any type of abundance, it's always sort of creates this questioning of who did I take that away from. I had a lot of trouble as a young person just dealing with just capitalism and in general, and like just seeing the negativity that it created. It was really a focal point in my mind, to the point where I would keep myself small to not be able to to participate in what I would consider a corrupt system. That's a direct experience of like Mercury questioning in this decan. So someone with the sun in this decan may identify through that excess, or potentially through the ability to use the excess to be generous to others. I believe Achyuta has the sun in this decan, and he's been very generous with the funds that he's raised with his Kickstarters to be able to give scholarships to people, to be able to fund projects and things of that nature. So that may be something that could have been playing out in his experience. If we look at a few of the other planets here, just to finish with the sun is also on a fixed star called Procyon, which roughly translates to little dog, and it was associated with raccoons. And Procyon was a fixed star that was sort of like the fireworks before Sirius would rise. It means before the dog. Okay, so it's Sirius was remember that really important fixed star that heralded abundance and fertility to the Nile. So when they saw Procyon, they were like, yeah, I'm really excited. I'm excited, and there's something good coming later. But also with the fixed star Procyon, if someone had the sun near this planet, I would say that some of your success may be fleeting, like a firework. You burn very brightly, and then it may fade a little bit, and you have to put effort into sustaining the success. Like maybe there will be a talk here, and if I want to utilize the energy of this talk, there will be more work to be done, right? And then we see both Mars and Venus hanging out in the 11th house. They are not in the sect in favor, so there may be compromises with these particular planets, with Venus and Mars. Okay, so this is in that decan that was associated with the 7 of Wands, where we're fighting for authenticity. And we are this particular person would have a separating aspect from the union of Venus and Mars. So there might be something in their life with regards to friendships, and bringing in significations with Mars as the ruler of the 7th house and the 2nd house with money and partnerships. Okay, so this is where this energy is being distributed to. It's acting through the story of the 11th house, but it is bringing in the narratives of the 7th and the 2nd. You see how we do that? So that is one way to think about this. Now, in this particular chart, we've got Jupiter in the first decan of Pisces, associated with the 8 of Cups, and maybe going on that journey of exploration. It's retrograde in motion. It's in the 6th house, but it is providing for the 3rd house. But it's in its own house in the 6th, but it's retrograde, and it's in a cadent house. So it still may have some power, but it's in a house that it doesn't have as much power that it could unless it was angular. And it's also retrograde, which something given may be taken back. I want to leave some time for some questions, so I think that's a pretty good place to to stop. Here are some sources and decan books. A lot of them I mentioned over the course of the talk. One of the ones that I didn't mention was this in this list is the Tarot, Magic, Alchemy, Hermeticism, and Neoplatonism by Robert M. Place. This is a really cool book that combines a lot of these lenses together in one book, but I didn't have room to put this on the list. I also really like David Warner Matheson's books, The Ancient Worldwide System. He has 4 volumes that, are inspired by his work with Hamlet's Mill, another book that I really was eye-opening for me, which talks about the theory that most of the world's mythological stories are from sky observation. So that's really, really neat. We've got some James Holden translations, of course, 36 Faces and 36 Secrets, Mythesis, those magical grimoires, Abu Mashar, Benabel Wen is a great holistic tarot book, and then here's Aleister Crowley's Book of Thoth. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can contact me here. I have a website and you can book readings. I do decanic specific readings where I combine fixed stars and the decans and analyze your chart. I do transit readings. I do electional work. I do all sorts of stuff. If you want to find my partner, again, she's at Tanya Andrews on Instagram with a Tanya with a J and Third Coast Mojo. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter. I do put a lot of material out on my channel, Spencer Michaud Astrology, on YouTube, and do live streams for every new moon and full moon. If you subscribe to my newsletter, you can get updates for that. That's the best way to get in touch with me, and I give discounts for readings. And you can email me at spencermichaudastrology@gmail.com. Okay, questions?
Thank you, Spencer. That's been a very illuminating talk and informative, interesting, well presented. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm so happy that people were here.
Oh yeah, fun. People have been enjoying it. We've been getting nice comments in the chat box.
Yeah, I'm taking a look at it now. But any pertinent questions, you think?
Yes. Whitney asks, which decanate system are you using, and where do the daimon assignments to each decan come from? Is it from the Libre Hermetis?
Which decan rulership scheme? Is that the question?
Yes.
So I would say that I look predominantly at the Chaldean order of the planets to see the power. I've also, I think that what I realized that Austin does in his book is he's really combining, the Chaldean ruler and the triplicity ruler from the Vedic Dracana system to kind of give a vibe. And this is really seen in like the Gemini decans, because, for example, every Gemini decan is holding duality. Like the first decan is Jupiter and Mercury, the second decan is Venus and Mars, and the third is the Sun and Saturn. So examining both of them can give you more insight into the meaning of that particular face. As far as the deities go, I'm drawing those directly from the 36 heirs of the Zodiac. There's so many more layers I could put in there, but at a certain point I have to kind of be like, okay, this gives me a pretty good idea. And as I go along and learn more, I might, find different techniques that'll bring different realizations. But for the most part, use the technique that's going to bring you whatever experience of the truth that you need to get at that moment.
All right. Robert would like to know if you sell the decan flashcards that you were talking about earlier.
I'll tell you what, I had planned on making a Patreon and having those be a perk of a Patreon tier. And at the last moment, I did my Mercury rules my second house of money. I did my Mercury in the third decan of Cancer existential crisis, because that planet is retrograde and in the 12th. And I was like, this isn't, I don't want to make people pay for anything. I'm just going to do a donation site on Buy Me a Coffee, and I'm going to give everything away for free. And I bailed on my Patreon. But that being said, I think I may be revisiting that Patreon because I think it's a good model. And as much as I hate paywalls, I think that there is a place for being able to support people doing the work that they do. And I like the donation model, but I don't know if society is caught up with that completely yet. And I think that the short answer is, I think I'll relaunch a Patreon and make them a tier. If you really want to buy them, I can send me an email and I'll compile them as many as I have, and I will, make a donation on my Buy Me a Coffee and I'll send them to you. So yes.
From Rachel, what can the image or decan of our rising sign tell us about ourselves?
That's really interesting. Well, the rising sign is definitely, associated with the self. That first house is you. I think that when I'm analyzing a chart, I really look at that decan and the planet that is ruling it, to kind of see, what type of vibe that person may be doing. Another thing that I do is I look at the term or bound ruler. Like, for example, I have my ascendant in the terms of Mercury. So, and I also have my midheaven in the terms of Mercury. So I'm a very mercurial person. I like to blend things together and question things. I'm a questioner. I hope whatever I've said today, I don't consider a definitive statement. So the decking can show you the themes that may play out and your approach to both your body and to your personal experience. Like I said, my ascendant is in the third decan of Leo. And I've had many experiences where I've had to stand my ground to be able to move forward with my own authenticity. So it's a Mars ruled decan. So I've had to fight to be myself, fight to be an artist, fight to be an astrologer, in the face of disapproval, and just be like, well, your disapproval doesn't matter to me. I just need to be me, and this is who I am. And I think that you can see that with different decanic experiences on the ascendant. And was there a second part to that question? Sorry.
No, that was it. Very well said. Thank you. Okay, is there a correlation between the Thema Mundi sign placements and houses that links to the tarot? When discussing the card assignments, it becomes confusing if it applies to the sign or the house. Can you offer clarification?
Yes. The theory that I put forth with the Thema Mundi and the tarot is strictly my own. It was something that when I was reading Austin's book, especially his chapter on Nemesis and the joy of Saturn in the 12th house, I was thinking, those Gemini cards really reflect that experience in the 12th house, potentially of making amends for something and restoring balance and right proportion. And as I started connecting the dots, a lot of those narratives seem to really make sense, especially like Pisces. Like the cadent houses really work really well with that kind of system. I don't know if the Rider-Waite deck creators were referencing the Thema Mundi, but even if they weren't, somehow they were channeling something, because there's enough. I think that we can make enough conjecture. We can conjecture enough truth out of that to see that there's something there. But that theory is strictly my own.
Thank you. The book you referenced earlier, was that the 36 Heirs of the Zodiac?
Yeah, we've got a lot of 36 books, don't we? So we have 36 Faces by Austin Coppock, which is the original, kind of the OG book. Okay. Really great history in there. And just, he's an amazing writer. Please pick it up when you can. I know that it's not available now, but it's the ultimate source, and support him and his work. 36 Secrets is a more of a tarot book by T. Susan Chang that is newer and very good in its own right, and brings in the Kabbalah a little bit more. And then 36 Heirs of the Zodiac is a 2-page fragmentary text that also can be found on the internet under the name Cosmas, Comas, of Jerusalem. And that's the one that lists the decanic spirits or daimons that I associate with them.
Okay, thank you. And you're using the Egyptian decan system, right? Yes.
The Egyptian decan system?
Or Ptolemaic?
Well, I'm using all of it. We thinking about the in AstroGold, which decan system are you using? I'm using Egyptian terms. I believe that they only let you use quote unquote traditional decans. But if you want to see a super in-depth 50-minute long explanation of how to use AstroGold with decans and term wheels, I made a video of that on my site as well. But the system that I'm using with the wheel is the Chaldean decans.
Okay, a question from Nick. How did that Aries 2 ring work out for you? Did you feel it was successful? What effects did you notice? I ask because I've made a few Decan talismans now, and I haven't noticed pronounced effects in the same way as other planetary and fixed star talismans I've made. I'm wondering if I'm missing something about how to elect or construct them.
Well, I'll tell you. Yeah, I had a conversation with my partner earlier today about that ring because I don't really wear it. It's not for me. It was really for her. And the funny thing is the sun in her chart is in the 12th house. So it's a solar ring, right? It's in the 12th house and it rules the 8th house. And through the negative circumstances of the pandemic, I lost my regular job and was able to apply for unemployment. And I received, the pandemic unemployment insurance money and things like that. And she mentioned casually, the wealth came to you, not to me, because it was representing the 8th house. And it was through a really challenging circumstance, something like the pandemic. And so I think that that's kind of how it played out. Like I was able to avoid some of the more really negative effects of the pandemic. I've been super, super blessed and fortunate that that resource was available to me I was a gig worker. I was a musician at the beginning of the pandemic, and gig workers at all of our gigs were just eliminated completely. So, that resource was available for me. And this is a similar story to Achuta, who talked about his journey with, going on unemployment for a little while, helped him to transition to a career of professional astrology. And it's actually looking like it's playing out similarly for me in my transition from music to doing astrology full time.
Do you know if AstroSeek has a Decan setting?
I think that they do. They have all sorts of esoteric stuff. I only use AstroSeek a little bit because I think Astro Gold has a lot of the things that I would normally use there, but I think they might. I don't know for sure though. You'd have to look deeper into that.
Yeah, I think they do, but I don't know exactly where it is.
Yeah.
Okay, from Jennifer, if a house ruler is in aversion, would the Decan ruler be a good go-to secondary ruler that might give direction?
Say that one more time.
If a house ruler is an aversion, would the Decan ruler be a good go-to secondary ruler that might give direction?
That's a good question. And that's something that I've been meditating on a lot. After hearing Martin Hermes talk, he was suggesting that the exaltation ruler can provide for a planet if the domicile ruler is an aversion. And I had this same question as well. Does that extend to triplicity rulers and Decan rulers? And the fact of the matter is I don't know. I hope it does, because I think that one of the challenges I have in my own chart is that the ruler of my ascendant is in aversion to my ascendant. There is no exaltation lord because it's Leo. The triplicity lord is the sun. And so that would kind of leave me with the Decan ruler, which is Mars, but I guess that's also in aversion. So I'm just kind of screwed when it comes to the first house. But I think it's possible. I think that one thing that I would say in regards to that is I asked somebody about this. I don't know if it was Martine directly or not, but I think that what you would do in that case is look to a planet that would aspect both the Lord and the house itself as an intermediary to be able to filter significations and clay through that. So, like, for example, the moon in my chart is exalted on the midheaven in Taurus, and it filters the sun's action through the 10th house to probably, and it also aspects the first house. So I think there's a lot of action that filters through that moon to give me a sense of purpose, identity, individuation.
Okay. Question from Mari. Can we see that the planets shared the coming of the Enlightenment, which darkened the influence of the skies, so to speak? I don't know if that word shared is correct or if it's a typo, but like, did the planets indicate the coming of the Enlightenment, which would darken the influence of astrology itself, to your knowledge?
I mean, I'd have to look at a chart. Off the top of my head, I don't know, but I mean, obviously, yes. I think that, and I don't mean that condescendingly. I think that just thinking about it, the planets are always helping to reflect the experience that we're having here on this earth, and I'm sure that there may have been shifts. The traditional astrologers would probably look at the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions and the elements that they're moving through, and the shifts from different uh, Earth ages, and like maybe we just started an air element, and maybe we had something with the beginning of the Earth element in that enlightenment, where we went from fire and like this like passion and spirituality of the fire Jupiter Saturn conjunctions, and we got into this industrial revolution, you know, material age, right? With the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions and the Earth signs, and now we're moving into this air age, which is decentralizing things and opening things back up again, and saying, well, we've exhausted the material ability of the Earth to produce by abusing it without infusing it with intelligence or spirituality, and now we need to move back into like a more rational experience of it that is not so dependent on materialism. That's the best answer I have for that. Probably some outer planet stuff that's going on too, but yeah, I'm somewhat of a human ephemeris, but not that good. Like, not yet.
Like a Chuda, he's like, it's all in his head. It's amazing. We have Tanya here. Hi, Tanya. Lovely to virtually meet you. She writes, we also had kind of a weird bubble effect on our whole house after the Aries Decan 2 magic working. Like it created a little pocket of safety and prosperity. We seem to really be shielded from the worst aspects of the pandemic, especially financially. I also made some hoodoo materials that we used, herbs, baths, and oils that probably boosted it a little. That's good to hear.
Yeah, we've been, as a Cancer sun with the sun in the 12th house, it was kind of just business as usual for me. I was just like, oh, I'm stuck in my house and I don't see people. Okay, let me just go read some books. But I totally understand that was completely a fortunate and quite frankly privileged position, and that a lot of people have experienced enormous hardship and pain and suffering through this. So I don't want to diminish that experience at all. We also have been extremely disciplined in our house about social distancing, mask wearing, and basically just isolating in place since this whole thing has started. And if I'm honest, I'm having a little bit of difficulty reintegrating into society, and I'm a little nervous about Jupiter retrograding back into Aquarius.
Yeah, I feel that too. Are you familiar with Liana Saif's work?
I am not. What is that?
I'm not either. That's an anonymous suggestion. We might have to look into it.
I'll have to look into that.
All right. And that's it for today's talk. Let me just remind everybody where you can catch the replays. Oh, and now, come on. all of a sudden my technology started getting wonky. Like my earbuds, like the battery ran out and I had to switch to my other headphones. Okay, here we go.
Well,
All
the
right.
ascendant just clicked over into Scorpio with Mars in the overcoming position. So
Makes perfect. Astrology in action. Thank you. Okay, so so the replay of this talk will be available for 7 days to the general public at nightlightastrology.com. Events, speaker series. Again, beginning tomorrow. If you're a currently enrolled student, you will receive a recording of this talk. Please be sure to tune in tomorrow for our second summer speaker series talk presented by Charlie Overt at 3 p.m. Eastern time, and next weekend for Danielle Blackwood presenting on July 24th at 12 p.m. Register to attend live if you haven't already. And how do I stop my share? Stop share. Okay. And that's it. Thank you, Spencer, for such a lovely talk. Sirens and all, we got through it. Thank you, everyone, for attending and for being such a lovely audience. And I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow, hopefully.
yeah,
Thank you. Take
great.
care.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. I really appreciate your presence here. So thank you so much. And thank you, Delia.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, everyone.